Welcome back to University College London. We can now welcome Michael Berkowitz from Hebrew and Jewish Studies.
Thank you very much. I'm admittedly talking about something that is mostly quite obscure to this audience. It was even quite obscure to me. It's a play from the mid-1950s. It's actually set in the early years of the State of Israel. And as you'll be hearing, I don't know very much about it outside the play itself. That is for a number of reasons. I'm at a loss as far as what's happened with the author. I'm not sure if it's been performed, but I think it's quite interesting that it was actually produced in the English language in quite a nice volume by a respectable publisher. And I think part of the reason for this is it's really not a bad play. It's a pretty good play, but I think part of the reason why it's been ignored is because it touched a lot of raw nerves. It still touches raw nerves, and also it's in some ways an exercise in wishful thinking, and things didn't quite turn out the way that the play predicted that it would turn out. Let me just say a little bit about the author first. I should say that the title of it is Dark and Bright. It's from 1956, and this is set in 1951. Its author is Leon Bernstein, and this might sound like something of a Jewish joke, but one of the reasons why I'm having such a hard time finding out anything about this author is there are so many people named Leon Bernstein. I mean, I'm sorry, this is almost impossible. I mean, you can almost go to a building in New York and find, 19 Leon Bernstein. So, again, it makes it amazingly difficult. He's from Lithuania. Okay, how many Leon Bernsteins are from Lithuania? Even narrowing it down to when he was born. He was born in 1914 in Skuras, which was then in Germany. That is in the western part, in the western part of Lithuania, which is this area that the Germans refer to as Memel. And he apparently received a Germanized education. That is, he most likely spoke Yiddish, but also German. There was a very good chance he was educated in German schools. If he was well off, there was a good chance that his mother actually went into Germany in order for, sort of further in order for him to be born. That was something a rather fashionable thing to do. He graduated from the university
in Vilna, or what the Jews call Vilna, what of course now Lithuanians refer to as Vilnius, in mathematics and philosophy, which is very unusual. So it would be a rather strange combination. He joined what was referred to as the underground, that we would call a resistance group, anti-Nazi resistance group during the war. I think it's most likely that he was part of a Jewish resistance group, although I'm not exactly sure. He eventually made his way to Italy. I'm not sure when he came to Italy. He was there from 1945 to 1949, where he was active in literary life. He came to Israel, and the proper term would be Israel because it's after 1948, after it's declared statehood, and he started teaching at the High School of Law and Economy. So I think maybe part of the reason is he never became an academic per se or a major literary figure, and I think this sometimes happens to people who teach more on a high school level. He continued to write mostly in German, and in addition to this play, he published at least 2 books of poetry, one of which was highly praised by none other than Thomas Mann. Well, I want to say something before I get to the actual discussion of the play itself. I want to refer to a book by a colleague of ours who's at the University of Maryland, named James Harris. He wrote a book in the early 1990s called The People Speak, and it's about anti-Semitism in Bavaria around the time of the revolutions of 1848. And one of his motivations in writing this book is that he was very sort of moved, in some ways disturbed, by a tendency among scholars to valorize anything that peasants or other oppressed people would do as being somehow a good thing, or in some way progressive or humanitarian. Because what he found is that when peasants got mobilized in 1848, they got mobilized mainly to make sure that Jews were not granted equal rights. And in some cases, they got people to sign petitions, and even if they couldn't read the things themselves, and they would trudge 19 miles through the snow in order to deposit them so their opinions would be known. So one of the reasons why I'm saying this is that this is kind of a strange story, because there are some aspects of it which we could say are rather attractive in terms of, racial barriers being overcome and people getting together. But in the end, there's sort of a creepy end of the story that people might end up getting together in the end, but sort of what they're up to once they get together might not be all that attractive. And maybe this will be a little bit more clear once I discuss the play. Okay, Dark and Bright represents an attempt to confront racial prejudice in the early years of Israel's statehood. It has almost nothing to say about Arabs. It's about racial prejudice within the Jewish world. The conflict surrounding the issue of race, as portrayed in the play, is between Israelis, again, this is after 1948, Israelis who have emigrated from Central and Eastern Europe, of course, many of whom had come to Palestine before the establishment of statehood, that is, versus their late arriving black Jews, or so-called black Jews, in this case from Yemen. Well, on the one hand, it is impressive, that is, the play is impressive and courageous in articulating the racism held by Jews, especially those from Germany, who should have known better by the 1950s. The solution it offers, quite hurriedly toward the end, is not terribly convincing. But strangely, the story that it imagines almost happens, but not in the way that it's described. That is, the story imagines a kind of German Jewish and Sephardi or Arab Jewish alliance, where these groups come together in seeing that, they have these common interests, and in some ways it's rather strange that the black Jews think that, these German Jews really can do their bidding. But what actually happened is a bridge was created across some of these great divides, but it happened later. This is after 1967, after the Arab-Israeli War, of course, what Jews would refer to as the Six-Day War, and there was a sort of alliance that was forged between an old white element and the newer, say, Yemeni and Moroccan groups, but this occurred under the umbrella of the nascent right wing at the time. So something like this did happen in terms of these groups really coming together, but it did not happen in the kind of constellation that we see. That is, what happened is an alliance wound up being formed between the arch-conservative or an arch-conservative Orthodox faction, which actually did come out of Lithuania, in a way out of a very specific type of group, and the young Sephardi immigrants in the wake of the Six-Day War and in the subsequent Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. So the play's attempt to grapple with race as openly as it did, however, probably made it, that is, at the time, too raw for public consumption in Israel and the rest of the Jewish world in the mid-1950s. Now, one of the things about it which is so interesting is you have this German Jewish town councilor, and his son falls in love with a Yemenite woman who is clearly very, very dark, who his family sees as black, and he falls in love with her, and they get married, and she ends up getting pregnant fairly quickly. And of course, the way that the story develops is, there's a great comedy of errors and various misdirections and all sorts of funny plots. And again, it's really not a bad play in many ways. But in the end, the family is utterly thrilled that they are on something that they see as kind of a cutting edge of future racial harmony. So, and it's a fantasy, again, an absolute fantasy, but it isn't the way that things work out. Now, one of the things that we could say is, there still is prejudice in the modern state of Israel between the older establishment as Jews who come from Central and Eastern Europe and the Jews who come from Arab countries and the Middle East. But in many respects, and again, I think this isn't simply sort of a positive stereotype, but much of this has indeed been overcome. That is, in terms of levels of intermarriage and integration. Again, much of this has been sort of solved in a way, but you have some other wrinkles here as well. That is, we have a couple of other black populations. There was a group that came actually in the 1960s and 1970s that identified itself as black Hebrews. But one of the reasons why this is so difficult, there's sort of a religious problem along with this, with mainstream Jews not seeing them as Jewish. And then, of course, the phenomena that most people are familiar with is the Jews who came from Ethiopia. And also, in this regard, there also is something of a religious problem. Now, there's also a very big problem with what Jews see as continuity in Jewishness with the waves of Jews who came from the former Soviet Union. So we have a different kind of problem at that level. But I think I want to end my comments here by saying that it's a very, very complex problem which has all kinds of contradictions, but within it, I think we can see that there are some things that within modern Israeli society, they have resolved fairly well. But the great downside of this is that in this sort of new unification of Israelis from different backgrounds, there's a much sharper definition of themselves as over and against the Arab world and everyone else in the world. So although we could say it's sort of succeeded in a way of becoming a kind of melting pot, it also has this other perspective of sort of seeing itself as posed in another direction. Okay, thank you very much.